One ordinary liquid was once guarded so carefully that families passed it down like land. Not gold, not jewelry, not a deed to a farm, a jar of vinegar, and whatever was inside it was alive. So how did an accident that nobody wanted, that ruined the thing it came from, become valuable enough to inherit, strong enough to march with armies, and common enough to end up forgotten at the back of your kitchen cupboard? It sounds impossible. Today, it is one of the cheapest things in your kitchen. You buy a bottle without thinking. You splash it into a pan, and then you forget it exists. But there were homes where losing that jar was a catastrophe. Mothers handed it to daughters on their wedding day. Families carried it when they moved house. They kept it in the coolest corner, checked it, protected it, and fed it. Because whatever was inside that jar was alive, and nobody in the family could tell you how old it was. The same thing happened in China, in Italy, in the Middle East, in villages that never knew the others existed. Different languages, different crops, same strange treasured jar. And it did not stay in the kitchen. Roman soldiers carried this liquid across 3 continents, and it kept them alive on water that made other men sick. Greek doctors poured it into open wounds 2,000 years before anyone knew what an infection was. Merchants crossed deserts with it. Sailors crossed oceans with it. Families measured whether they would survive the winter by whether one jar in a dark corner was still working. For thousands of years, this was one of the most useful things a human being could own. And here is the part that makes no sense. Nobody invented it. There is no inventor, no workshop, no moment of genius. It arrived because somebody made a mistake, threw nothing away, and paid attention. So this isn't really a story about a condiment. It's a story about survival, about winters that families were not supposed to live through, about the quiet things that carried civilizations while history was busy writing down the names of kings. There is a bottle of it in your kitchen right now, probably at the back of a cupboard, beside the cooking oil, so ordinary you have not looked at it properly in years. So here is what this story is going to explain. To find the answer, we have to go back, way back, before supermarkets, before glass bottles, before refrigerators of any kind, to a world with a desperate problem, and no idea that the solution was already sitting in a jar someone had given up on. Let's begin where the hunger began. Before vinegar. A small house made of mud brick, somewhere in the ancient world. Outside, the sun is heavy. Inside, it is dark and cool. A woman kneels beside a clay jar, checking the food her family will eat this week. She lifts the lid. The smell tells her everything. The vegetables at the bottom have gone slimy. The fruit has collapsed into a sticky mess. Half of it must be thrown away. She has 3 children and no shop to walk to. This is not a bad day. This is a normal day. For most of human history, food had a clock ticking inside it from the moment it was picked, caught, or killed. And that clock ran fast. In hot climates, meat could spoil before a family finished eating it. Fish went bad within hours. Soft fruit lasted days. So people ate quickly, or people lost food. Now think about the seasons. Crops don't grow all year. In many places, everything ripens at once. For a few weeks, there is more food than a family can eat. Then, for months, almost nothing grows at all. That gap between the harvest and the hunger was the most dangerous stretch of the year. People tried everything they could think of. They dried food in the sun until it was hard as wood. They buried it in cool earth. They smoked it over slow fires. They packed it in salt when they could afford salt at all. Every method had a cost. Drying changed the taste. Smoking took time and fuel. Salt was expensive. And none of it worked on everything. A cucumber cannot be smoked. Soft fruit cannot be dried without losing almost everything that made it good. So families lived close to the edge. What they grew, they had to use. What they could not use, they lost. This is the world before vinegar. A world where the biggest enemy was not war, and it was not weather. It was time. And here is the strange part. The answer was already sitting in those same houses. In jars nobody was watching. In pots pushed into a warm corner and forgotten. The very thing people were throwing away in disgust was the thing that could have saved them: the accidental discovery. To understand the accident, we have to start with something people already loved: alcohol. Long before anyone knew what bacteria were, humans had learned to make wine from grapes, beer from grain, and fermented drinks from dates, honey, apples, and rice. They didn't understand the science. They just knew that if you crushed fruit and left it in a warm jar, the juice bubbled, changed, and became wine. It was precious. It was traded, celebrated, and stored with care. But sometimes a jar was left open too long. A lid didn't sit properly. A pot stood in a warm corner and was forgotten. And when someone came back and tasted it, the wine was gone. In its place was something sharp, sour, almost biting. To the person holding that jar, this was a disaster. Weeks of work, ruined. The French language still carries that disappointment. The word vinegar comes from vinaigre, sour wine. But here is what was really happening inside that jar. There are tiny living things in the air all around us. Some of them are bacteria called acetobacter. They are far too small to see. They drift on the breeze, land on fruit skins, and settle on the rim of an open pot. These bacteria have one favorite meal: alcohol. When air reaches wine or beer, acetobacter goes to work. It eats the alcohol and turns it into acetic acid. That is vinegar. That's the whole secret. 2 steps. Yeast turns sugar into alcohol. Bacteria turn alcohol into vinegar. The first step must be sealed away from air. The second step needs air. So all it took to make vinegar by accident was one badly covered jar, which means vinegar was not discovered once, in one place, by one clever person. It was discovered everywhere. Wherever people made wine or brewed beer, vinegar appeared. In China, India, Egypt, the Middle East, Europe. The same accident happened again and again, in kitchens that had never heard of each other and never would. Nobody invented vinegar. Nature invented it. Humans simply noticed. And when they looked closely at those ruined jars, they saw something that must have frightened them a little. Floating on top of the sour liquid was a pale, rubbery disc. Cloudy, slippery, thicker than skin. It had not been there when the jar was filled. Today we call it the mother of vinegar. It is a living mat, built by those invisible bacteria as they work. And now you know what was in the jar the bride carried out of her mother's house. Because once people realized that this strange thing was what turned wine sour, they stopped throwing it away. They started feeding it. Drop the mother into fresh wine and you don't have to wait for luck. Vinegar every time. So families kept theirs, in a covered jar in the coolest corner of the house, fed and protected like a quiet pet. Some were passed from mother to daughter. Some were handed to a bride when she left home, so she could start her own kitchen with something living from her mother's. In parts of Italy, families still hand down barrels of aging vinegar as an inheritance, some of them older than anyone alive in the house. Think about that. Not a recipe, not a bottle. A living thing, older than the family, passed hand to hand across generations, doing exactly the same job the whole time. But why would anyone bother? Why keep something alive just to make food taste sour, the liquid that saved winter? Go back to that clay jar and to the woman kneeling beside it. Now give her something she did not have before. It is autumn in Mesopotamia, 7,000 years ago. The harvest is in, and it is a good one. Too good. There are more cucumbers, onions and beans in her courtyard than her family could eat in a month, and in 3 days, most of them will be rotting. Every year of her life, this was the cruel joke of farming. Plenty, then nothing. This year, she does something different. She packs the vegetables into a tall clay jar, tight, right to the top. Then she pours in the sour liquid from the ruined wine until everything is covered. She seals it. She pushes it into the dark corner of the room. And she waits. Weeks pass. The weather turns. In the hungry part of winter, she breaks the seal. The smell is sharp. The vegetables inside are still whole, still firm, still food. She feeds her children in a season that would once have emptied her house. That is pickling. And it may be one of the most important things our ancestors ever learned. Here is why it works, though nobody could have explained it then. Almost all the invisible creatures that rot food need conditions that acid destroys. Vinegar is acid. Drop food into it, and the rotting simply stops. A cucumber that would have turned to mush in 3 days can sit in that jar for a whole season and come out crisp. Which means the clock inside food, the clock that had ruled human beings since the beginning, could finally be stopped. Not slowed, stopped. And think what that does to a family. A good harvest is no longer wasted. A bad month is survivable. It is the difference between a winter where everyone eats and a winter where somebody doesn't. And notice who is doing this. Not a king, not a priest, not a scientist. A mother with a jar. Vinegar was never a luxury. It was cheap, made from leftovers, made from things that had already gone wrong. A wealthy family could afford salt, ice pits, and servants. An ordinary family could afford a jar in a warm corner. Vinegar was the poor family's refrigerator. We know how far this spread because some of it never left. In Egypt, archaeologists have opened clay vessels sealed around 5,000 years ago. Jars that sat through empires, sandstorms, and the collapse of whole kingdoms, and found the chemical traces of vinegar still inside. The people are gone. The language is gone. The vinegar is still there. In Babylon, records mention vinegar made from dates, used to preserve food and to keep travelers going. Babylonians were also among the first to improve it on purpose, adding herbs and spices to the jar. And in ancient China, vinegar mattered so much that noble households employed a specialist whose only job was making it. Not a cook, not a servant, a professional vinegar maker. That is how important a sour accident had become. But vinegar was not going to stay in the family kitchen, because the moment traders realized that this liquid could keep food alive on a journey, it climbed onto ships and went everywhere. Vinegar travels. Imagine a Phoenician sailor, 3,000 years ago, loading a ship on the coast of the Mediterranean. He is not thinking about history. He is thinking about food. A ship has no market. Whatever goes on board at the start has to last until the end. Water goes stale in the barrels. Meat spoils in days. Bread turns hard, then green. Sailors starved on ships that were full when they left. So down in the hold, beside the cargo, go the jars. Pickled vegetables that will still be good in a month. Vinegar itself, which lasts almost forever, because nothing dangerous can live in it. Vinegar sailed the Mediterranean not as treasure, but as ordinary supplies. And every time that ship landed, the idea landed with it. Now move inland, onto the long trade routes across Asia, the roads and mountain passes we now call the Silk Road. Picture a merchant leading loaded animals through a cold, empty landscape. He may not see a town for weeks. Silk and spices are in the packs, but strapped to one animal is a jar of pickled vegetables. And that jar is the reason he will still be walking in 20 days. Something interesting happens when an idea travels this way. It does not arrive as a copy. It arrives as a suggestion. A trader mentions, over a fire, that back home, people keep vegetables in sour liquid all winter. A local family tries it, but with the crops they grow and the spices they like. Within 1 generation, that town has its own version. Within 3, nobody remembers it came from anywhere else. This is how vinegar spread. Not by conquest, not by law, by conversation. And then vinegar reached a place where it stopped being useful and became something closer to essential. Rome. Why would an empire's army march across 3 continents carrying a flask of sour accident? The Roman kitchen walk. Into a Roman city, and the first thing you notice is the noise. Carts on stone streets, traders shouting prices, smoke drifting between tall apartment blocks. Most Romans did not live in villas with marble floors. They lived in crowded apartments, 3 or 4 floors up, often with no kitchen at all. Fire was terrifying in a wooden building. So many families barely cooked at home. They ate on the street, at small counters selling hot food, bread, olives, cheese, and salted fish. Fast food, 2,000 years ago. Now walk through the market with a Roman woman shopping for her family, and you understand why vinegar mattered so much. Olives sitting in the sun. Fish landed that morning, already smelling strong. Vegetables picked days ago. Meat hanging in open air with flies circling. Nothing is refrigerated. Nothing is sealed. Everything on that stall is quietly going bad while the trader shouts the price. Buy too much, and half of it goes in the gutter by the weekend. Unless she has a jar of vinegar at home. With vinegar, that pile of cheap vegetables becomes next month's meals. That fish can be kept. That tough cut of meat is suddenly worth buying. For a family 3 floors up in a crowded building, vinegar was not a fancy ingredient. It was security. But the most extraordinary Roman use of vinegar was not in the kitchen at all. It was in the army. Roman soldiers drank something called posca. Posca was simple. Sour wine or vinegar, mixed with water, sometimes with herbs thrown in. Officers and rich Romans preferred proper wine. Posca was the drink of soldiers and working people. Now here is the part worth stopping for. Roman legions marched enormous distances, across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. Along the way they drank whatever water they could find, rivers, streams, wells in strange towns. Throughout history, bad water has killed far more soldiers than battles have. The Romans had no idea why. The idea that invisible living things could crawl into a man's stomach and kill him would not arrive for another 1,800 years. Picture it, late afternoon, somewhere in Gaul, 20 miles of marching behind them. The column reaches a stream, brown, slow-moving, with cattle standing in it further upriver. Most of the men drop their packs and drink straight from it. They are too thirsty to care. One soldier doesn't. He fills his flask, tips in a measure of sour wine from the skin at his belt, swirls it, and waits a moment before he drinks. He is not protecting himself from germs. He has never heard the word. Nobody has. He does it because it is what his unit does. Because it tastes better than warm river water. Because the older men swore by it. 3 days later, some of the men who drank straight from that stream are too sick to march. He is not one of them. Nobody could explain why. But across generations of marching, the army noticed. They were right. Acid makes it far harder for many harmful bacteria to survive. Roman soldiers were carrying a mild disinfectant in their flasks and drinking it all day long. They just thought it was a cheap drink. An empire crossed 3 continents, partly because of an accident in a wine jar that nobody could explain. And they were not only drinking it, they were pouring it on open wounds. Which brings us to the strangest chapter in this whole story. Why did the ancient world's most famous doctor reach for vinegar before almost anything else? Medicine, cleaning, and survival. Around 2,500 years ago in Greece, there lived a physician named Hippocrates. He is often called the father of medicine. He taught something unusual for his time, that illness has natural causes and that watching a patient carefully matters more than superstition. Hippocrates used vinegar constantly. He washed wounds with it. He mixed it with honey for coughs and sore throats. He used it on sores that would not heal. Now, let's be honest. Ancient medicine got a great deal wrong. Many old remedies did nothing at all, and some did harm. But wound cleaning was different. Nobody in that world knew infection was caused by living things too small to see. Hippocrates certainly didn't. Yet vinegar's acid genuinely makes it hard for many bacteria to survive. So while other treatments failed, this one quietly worked. Which means one of humanity's first useful antiseptics was not discovered by a doctor at all. It was discovered by someone who ruined a jar of wine. Now picture a kitchen in medieval Europe. A low fire. Smoke stains on the wall, herbs drying from a beam, and along one wall, rows of jars holding everything this household will eat before the world turns green again. An old woman works there through autumn. Her hands are cracked from brine, and she doesn't look at what she's doing anymore. She has packed these jars every October for 50 years. She counts them the way other people count money. Winter in medieval Europe was long, and fresh food simply stopped existing for months. What went into those jars in October was what her family would eat in February. So autumn was a race. Vegetables packed into vinegar, fruit preserved, fish salted and soured. If she got it right, her grandchildren ate. If the seals failed, they didn't. We tend to imagine history's turning points as battles and kings. But for most families who ever lived, survival came down to a woman, a jar, and whether it held. Vinegar was working in that room in other ways too. It cut grease off pots, dissolved the hard crust in kettles, and washed down the boards where meat had been. In a world with no cleaning products of any kind, that mattered enormously. And when the plagues came, people soaked cloths in vinegar and pressed them to their faces, certain the sharp smell was holding death back. There is a famous French legend about 4 thieves who robbed the homes of plague victims and never fell ill. Caught at last, they traded their secret for their freedom. A vinegar soaked with garlic and herbs. It is a story, not history. Vinegar did not protect anyone from the plague. But it tells you something true. When people were terrified, vinegar was what they reached for. Preserve the food, wash the wound, clean the pot, flavor the meal. One cheap liquid, doing 4 jobs in almost every home in the world. And yet no 2 homes were making it quite the same way. Every culture makes it their own. Nearly every food culture on the planet has a vinegar. Almost none of them got it from each other. They got it from whatever grew nearby. Start with a fisherman in Japan, more than 1,000 years ago. He has a good catch and a serious problem. Fish rots faster than almost any food on earth, and he cannot sell it all today. So he packs the fish in cooked rice and seals it away. The rice slowly ferments and turns sour, and that sourness keeps the fish edible for months. When the family finally opens it, the fish is the meal. The rice has done its job and is thrown away. That was the beginning of sushi. Not a delicacy, a survival trick that smelled powerful and took half a year. Centuries later, cooks asked a simple question. What if we skip the waiting and season the rice with vinegar instead? Same sour taste, same day. The dish that people now queue around the block for, that chefs train for a decade to make, grew out of a desperate way to stop fish from going bad. Now travel to the Philippines. No grapes, no barley, but coconut palms everywhere, and sugarcane, and a climate so hot that meat can turn in a single afternoon. So Filipino cooks made vinegar from coconut sap and cane juice, and built a whole way of cooking on top of it. Picture a family with a piece of pork and no way to keep it. It goes into a pot with vinegar, garlic and salt, and simmers until tender. That is adobo. It tastes wonderful, and it also lasts days longer than fresh meat ever could in that heat. The national dish of a country is, underneath, a preservation method. Now go north. Cold streets, coal smoke. England in the 1800s. There, people brewed ale from barley. Leave ale open to the air, and acetobacter does what it always does. You get malt vinegar, dark, strong, unmistakable. Then fried fish met fried potatoes in the new industrial cities, wrapped in paper and eaten standing up in the rain. And the sharp thing shaken over the top was that same brown vinegar. A Japanese fisherman, a Filipino cook, an English factory worker with hot chips in newspaper. None of them ever met. None knew the others existed. All 3 were using the same invisible bacteria. Wine countries made wine vinegar. Orchards made apple cider vinegar. In the Middle East, date vinegar stayed exactly what it always had been. Different crops, different climates, different flavors. Same invisible bacteria underneath all of it. One accident, repeated 1,000 times over. And for all those thousands of years, every drop of it was made slowly, by hand, in jars and barrels. Then, in the space of 2 centuries, that changed completely from handmade to factories. For most of history, making vinegar meant waiting. You filled a barrel, gave the bacteria air, and left them alone. Weeks passed, sometimes months. In the French region of Orléans, makers perfected a slow barrel method that artisan producers still use today. It made superb vinegar. It just made it slowly. Then came the 1800s. Cities were swelling. Millions were leaving farms for towns where food was bought rather than grown, and slow barrels could not keep up. In Germany in the 1820s, a faster method appeared. Instead of a barrel, a tall tower packed with wood shavings. Alcohol trickled down through the shavings, while air flowed up from below. More air meant more bacteria working at once. Weeks instead of months. But nobody still knew what was actually doing the work. That answer came from a French scientist named Louis Pasteur. In the 1860s, Pasteur showed that the change from wine to vinegar was not a chemical reaction at all. It was caused by living organisms that needed oxygen to do their job. After 7,000 years, humans finally understood the accident. And understanding it meant controlling it. Producers could keep the right bacteria, hold the right temperature, and get the same result every time. Then came glass. Mass-produced bottles meant vinegar could be sealed, labeled, shipped, and stacked on a shelf. It no longer came from a neighbor's barrel or your grandmother's jar. It came from a factory with a name on it. Something quietly ended there. The living mother that families had kept for generations, fed and carried and handed to daughters, simply stopped being necessary. You could buy a bottle for the price of a loaf of bread. Most of those old jars were emptied and never filled again. The final leap came in 1949, when a new method was described in which alcohol is held in huge tanks and constantly stirred while air is pumped through it. The bacteria are surrounded by oxygen. Instead of months, vinegar can be made in a day or two. That is how most vinegar in the world is made today. And here is the part worth pausing on. Nothing essential changed. The tanks are steel, the bottles are machine-made. The process is watched by computers. But inside those tanks, the same bacteria are doing the same thing they did in a forgotten jar in ancient Babylon. Eating alcohol, making acid. We didn't improve the accident. We just learned how to hurry it up. So what does all of that have to do with the bottle sitting in your kitchen right now? Your kitchen. Go back to that cupboard. Open it. There it is. Same bottle. Same label you have never really read. Sitting quietly beside the cooking oil, where it has always been. Only now you know what you are looking at. That liquid is the reason a mother in Mesopotamia could feed her children in the middle of winter, and a Roman soldier could drink from a strange stream and keep marching, and a medieval grandmother could look at her jars in October and know her family would make it to spring. It runs through the long story that eventually gave us sushi, and adobo, and pickles, and fish and chips, and your grandmother's recipe that nobody else can quite get right. Cultures that never met, that shared no language and no border, all stumbled into the same discovery and built completely different food traditions on top of it. And every one of those traditions began the same way, with a mistake, with a jar left open, with wine that turned, with someone standing there, disappointed, holding something they thought was ruined. That is what makes vinegar different from almost everything else in your kitchen. Bread was developed, cheese was refined, cooking was learned, vinegar was found. It was always going to happen, in every corner of the world, the moment human beings made alcohol and let it meet the air. Nature was making vinegar long before we were. We simply paid attention. So the next time you are standing in your kitchen, look at that bottle properly. It costs almost nothing. It will probably outlast everything else on the shelf. But it has crossed continents. It has outlived empires. It has fed families through winters that would have starved them. It has cleaned wounds, filled soldiers' flasks, saved harvests, and carried recipes from one generation to the next. It has been in kitchens for 7,000 years, and it has never once asked to be noticed. Think for a moment about every kitchen it has ever stood in. A clay jar in Babylon, sealed before winter. A crowded Roman apartment, 3 floors up. A vinegar maker's workshop in ancient China. A fisherman's house in Japan. A cold medieval pantry, waiting for spring. A fish and chip shop on a wet evening. And yours, tonight, thousands of years apart. Languages that no longer exist. People who would not have understood a single word of each other. All of them holding the same sour liquid, made by the same invisible bacteria, doing the same quiet job it has always done. None of those people ever knew the others existed. The bacteria connected them anyway. So the next time you splash vinegar into a salad, over fish and chips, into a pickle jar, or into a family recipe, remember something. You are not just using a condiment, you are using one of humanity's oldest accidents. Vinegar was never invented. It was discovered by mistake. And that mistake quietly changed every kitchen in the world.